an interview with Mark Lemon, whose family has been in Acworth since the 1840s. And he hasn't been here all that time, but has been here in the old family home since, I guess you bought it in 92, and so you've had connections again with Acworth. But why don't we just begin by you talking about yourself a little bit? Where were you born?
I was born in Atlanta. Trying to remember the hospital, but I can't remember the hospital now. It's funny, I can remember stuff 200 years ago, but Georgia Baptist Hospital, I believe it was. And we lived on Claremont Road in Decatur for a number of years, and then my family moved. My dad built a house up on Lake Lanier, moved up there, and they were living there, my parents, when my dad had a stroke in 1980. That time I was in the Navy, and they had to move back closer to hospitals and medical facilities and whatnot. But yeah, we didn't move up here until I believe 1992, and that was preceded by a few trips of mine. I'm sure I probably caused a lot of irritation to the Corbins, because I would come up here a lot of times on military leave and just snoop around the property. I would always knock on the door and let them know I was here and ask them if I could take pictures and whatnot. But I became very, very interested in the house since I was a kid. My dad would drive the family up to Powder Springs and to visit my grandfather, and he would always swing by Acworth and drive by the house and just say, "Look out the window, boy. That's where your great grandfather lived. He was in the Civil War." And with my face pressed up against the window, I was hooked from that point on, and I'd always had an interest in the Civil War. But yeah, so I contacted the Corbins probably in the 80s, I guess, and told them
they had been there. They were there in about 10 years altogether.
And so I always let them know that if you ever decide to sell, let us know first, please, and because I know that you pay a realtor quite a big commission, and this would cut out that commission for them. So that's what happened. I received a call. I guess it was 92. They said they were ready to talk about selling. I think their daughter had graduated and was moving out, and they didn't. The house was big, and they didn't want to stay in a big house. But that's how we got involved, and how we were able to finally acquire the house and bring it back into the family. And it's been, 30 years now, I believe.
Before we get on to the history of the house, you were Naval Intelligence Service at that time?
Right. I was.
Talk about yourself. You graduated from school in Atlanta, I guess, and where did you go to college?
University of Georgia.
That's what and didn't you play football at Georgia?
I was on the freshman team and started on the freshman team, and then on the varsity. I was a little bit too small for varsity, but I did play. I was on special teams under Coach Dooley, and played. I was on the kickoff return teams. So that was, I guess it's better than nothing, but it was really, really interesting to be at that level in college sports and to have a little bit of a glimpse of what it's like. It was really, really really what I did mostly is for sports in college was play rugby. I had never heard of it, I'd heard of it, but I didn't know anything about it. And I was able to see some practices, and I just thought, man, this is I really connected with rugby because it's it's a contact sport, no pads, and a very, very dynamic kind of an activity, and it just was something that appealed to me quite a bit, and the parties afterwards were just epic, just beyond description. So I thought, yeah. So I played rugby just, I think, three or 4 years there at college. But
What did you major in college?
I majored in graphic design. Used to be called commercial art, but it was in the days before computers. So there was really no such thing as what do you call it? When something is, well, computer. There was no computer graphics back then. CGI.
Right.
It was all hand rendered stuff, which I'm happy for, because I'm glad I learned the old school way. It might have left me behind in technology, but I always liked the concept of being able to function without technology. In other words, sit down at a table, somebody gives you a piece of paper and a pencil, draw something, and I could always do that. Whereas people that were strictly computer graphic people, they would freeze up. I don't know about paper and pencil. What are you talking about? So I like being able to function in any kind of environment. But
Did you go through ROTC at University of Georgia?
There were some Navy recruiters that would show up outside the student center from time to time, and because my dad was a World War II Navy veteran,
His name was Frank?
Frank B. Lemon, and because he was a Navy veteran, of course that's what got my attention, or it got my interest because of him, and it always was a little bit sad for me because I knew his experience. That he wanted to fly, and after Pearl Harbor, he joined the Navy and went through the basic training to be a pilot. But he was enlisted. See, enlisted men were not normally able to fly, but they had a program called the V5 program that was for enlisted naval personnel could go through flight school. Because of necessity, because they needed more pilots. Well, by the time he made it through all that training, well, gunnery school, communications, radio, flight, basic flight, they had what was called the Marianas Turkey Shoot out in the Pacific, where they wiped out the Japanese naval air forces pretty much almost completely. And suddenly they had this flood of aviation trainees in the pipeline. They didn't need them anymore. So the first ones to get the axe were the enlisted guys. So he got cut, and it just devastated him. He went back to the blue water Navy, what we call it, and he was just crushed. But he wanted to get in combat. But he was on a ship, like a Liberty ship, and when they got off the coast of the Marianas, Saipan and Tinian, he begged to go ashore and in any kind of capacity. So he went like temporary duty with the Seabees and went ashore and was helping them build the runways on Tinian and Saipan. And Tinian, of course, is where the Enola Gay took off from that bombed Hiroshima. And yeah, so he went on security patrols around the perimeters of the airfields, and so he got to be in the war a lot more than he would have been if he hadn't really pressed it. He would just stayed on a ship, and I can completely sympathize with him. But anyway, that was my impetus to get into the Navy, and
so you had a college degree, and you got recruited, but you went in as an officer. Right.
Yeah. I got recruited, so to speak, or they put the hard sell on me, but I volunteered to go in, and I went in because I had already graduated, so I went in as an officer, and I went through the aviation pipeline because I kind of wanted to fulfill my dad's dream. Right. I went through AOCS down in Pensacola, which is Aviation Officer Candidate School,
And this is 1979?
79, and I was commissioned, I think it was like January of 80, and was immediately, well, I was in a pool for a while, like a sort of waiting for orders, and then I got sent to Whiting Field down there, VT6, Training Squadron 6, where I started flight training, and to my surprise and my disappointment, I was very, very, very unused to flying. I'd never flown anything before, and I had a Marine Corps captain as my instructor, very rigid, hardcore Marine Corps captain, and not very forgiving and not very patient, and I was very stiff on the controls. And I never was comfortable flying. I always forgot about the trim. I was very, very tight on the controls, and it's ironic because like 5 years later, I wasn't flying an airplane. I was flying a hovercraft, and I did that flying colors. I had no problem. So something happened in those 5 years, but yeah. So I decided. A guy sent me a pamphlet in the mail. This is back when they actually had pamphlets and there was no email or things like that. The guy sent me a letter with a pamphlet in it for Navy SEALs, and was called what was used to be called UDT, Underwater Demolition Team. It was UDT/SEALs, and I took a look at that pamphlet and I said, "Holy smokes, that's for me. That's the kind of an activity I could really get involved with." And so after a lot of thinking, a lot of soul searching, I made the decision to change my designator from aviation to special warfare. And I went into the commanding officer's office. I'll never forget this because it really struck me as kind of, I don't know. It just really was interesting that he would say this, but I said, I told him that I wanted to change my designator and stop training and go do something else. And I never saw a guy more disappointed. He was just like, he said, but you look like a fighter pilot, as if that was significant in any way. But I said, I'm sorry, I'm just not comfortable flying. So the Navy, of course, doesn't just go, oh, okay, you want to do something else? Sure, we'll accommodate you. No, especially being an officer, they've already put a lot of training, a lot of money into you, and they tell you that. They don't have any hesitation telling you that. And they say, well, you can do what you want to do at one point, but for now, you're going to go to sea. And so they sent me to sea as a shipboard officer, and I did that for about a little less than 2 years, and it usually takes 2 to 3 years to get surface warfare qualified. So what they said was I had to be qualified as a surface warfare officer, and that goes through navigation, communication, engineering, gunnery, all, and piloting the ship, driving the ship. You had to go through all of that stuff and get qualified to the captain's satisfaction, and before they would let you be qualified as a surface warfare. So I did it in pretty much record time because I was motivated to get out of there. I mean, it was romantic and all that stuff, but honestly, at that time, I looked at shipboard sailors as the lowest of the low. Was my perspective back then, because I wanted to be one of the elite. I wanted to do something that not everybody can do, and anybody can be stuck on a ship. Honestly, I mean, so it was just my thinking at the time. And so I got qualified, put in my request, and I had to do my physical qualifications test, and I did it. I did it in Italy, in one of the ports there, alongside an aircraft carrier. I did the swim in the ocean. They put me down in a little motor launch, and I did the swim in the ocean. I did the run on the flight deck of the aircraft carrier, and did the pull-ups and sit-ups and all that. And I got qualified at least I met the qualification, and I ended up getting into training BUDS, which is the acronym BUDS, basic underwater demolition SEAL training. I started that in, I guess, middle to late 1983, and that's a 6-month plus grueling training course. And I was about 2 weeks away from finishing it. I'd made it through Hell Week. I was a class officer. I was a senior officer in the class of about 125 guys, and they have a 75 to 80% attrition rate. It's just so difficult that guys quit. You just can't. They can't take the psychological pressure, the cold water, the incessant physical training, nonstop. It breaks a lot of people. And I had made it through the hardest part of it, which was Hell Week, is 5 days and nights around the clock of nonstop explosions, running, sand, drowning, exercises. It's beyond description. And I'd made it through, and I'd brought my class through. I was even commended for that. And then I go through the land warfare part of it, you're on the glide slope towards graduation, and I ended up breaking my ankle about 2 weeks before graduation, falling off the 20-foot tower on the obstacle course. It had rained the night before, and the top of it was slippery, and my hand slipped, and I broke my ankle. So I was recuperating for several weeks, not long enough for it to heal, when the following class got in a position where I was when I got hurt, and I had to join them, and then my ankle just came apart. It just wasn't healed up. So they said, "Mr. Lemon, we're going to have to medically discharge you for, you know." And I said, they actually tried to make me ring out. They have it's a very famous brass bell they have in the courtyard, and when somebody quits, they have to stand in front of that bell and ring it 3 times, and that means once you've done that, you're out. You're never allowed back in. And they actually made me stand there at the bell.
And you wouldn't ring.
And they kept. I was there for hours, and they kept yelling out the door, "Come on, Mr. Lemon! All you got to do is ring, and you can go have a hamburger or something." I said, I'm not quitting. I never wanted to quit. I'm not quitting, you know. And but they finally said, "All right, come on in." So then that's when they just said, "Look, the Navy's policy is with an officer, you get one chance to roll back." They said, ironically, if you were enlisted, you can roll back multiple times. That I always thought that was unfair, but so I had to go back into the larger community of the Navy, but I still didn't want to do big ship stuff. So I got into I stayed in special warfare, but I was in special boat units, which are the fast, highly armed, shallow draft patrol boats that insert and extract SEAL personnel under fire, usually, and they recover them. Now they've got these real super fast boats that come barreling around a bend in the river with machine guns firing and, you know, just laying down a wall of lead. They had something similar back then, but that's what I did after the SEAL training. And then I got an opportunity to do something brand new that kind of appealed to my flight interest, and that was I was on the ground floor of the Navy's new hovercraft technology. This is 1984, late 84, I believe, 85. And that's when they started having what's called LCAC, landing craft air cushion vehicles. Just these big double-screwed, double-prop assault hovercraft that would launch over the horizon from an amphibious ship and carry tanks or troops at very high speeds into the beach and up onto the beach. They didn't have to let them off in the surf zone. They could actually fly up onto the beach. So it was really cutting edge back then. And I said, man, that's for me. I always wanted to do something that was dynamic and different. And it just, I don't know why. I guess somewhere back in college, I got the understanding, just an awareness it sounds so obvious, like everybody knows this, but it really meant something to me. You got one chance. You have one life. You don't get to keep going back and doing it again and again. You got one life. So pack that life with as much interesting, difficult, exciting, challenging things as you can, because when I got to my thinking was, when I got to my 80s, I didn't want to look back with regret. I didn't want to look back and go, why didn't I do that? Mm-hmm. I had the chance and I didn't do that. I wanted to hit that decade, if I made it that long, having lived with no regrets. Mm-hmm. So that's. But yeah, I was in the hovercraft, Assault Craft Unit 5. I was, and as far as I know, I still am the only commissioned officer to ever be qualified in writing by the commanding officer of my unit as a hovercraft craft master, because that's normally a senior enlisted billet. That's normally for chief petty officers. Mm-hmm. But because we were shorthanded, and because I just drove the captain crazy with pestering him, saying, look, Captain, I need to know how to, if I'm going to run these boats, if these men are going to work for me, I need to know how they operate. Mm-hmm. I don't want some chief coming to me and just giving me a bunch of BS about, the thingamajig's not working. I need to know about that thingamajig. I need to know how it works. So he agreed, and he allowed me to get the training. So I ended up, I got my qualification letter, my badge, and everything. And it's something that officers would love to have, but they now, because they're fully staffed, they don't let them go through the training. Mm. So, and then that was what I did. I mean, I took those hovercraft on 2 Westpac deployments overseas, where they were highly successful. I even designed the logo. There was one little area where my art kind of crept into my Navy career. Was they had the lamest looking logo for that unit, which I thought needed to be really like kind of dynamic instead of flaccid like it was. And I designed their not only their patch, their logo, their patch, and the little metal pin that they wear, but I also gave them the name Swift Intruders, which is what they still use it today. It's like 40 years later. They still, and so, and that was, that was up to about 1988 when I got out of the Navy, because I was facing a choice of my detailer, which is the officer in charge of sort of shepherding your career, managing your career, kept pestering me with, look, you can't do all this fun stuff all your career. You're a naval officer. You got to go to department head school. I said, I don't have to do anything. It's my career. He said, well, you're shooting yourself. And I said, let me shoot myself in the foot. I know what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. And he had his mind set on, you do this, and then you do this, and then you do this, and then you're an admiral. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I don't want to be an admiral. I've seen admirals. Mm-hmm. I know what admirals are, and they're politicians in uniform. Absolutely true. They're absolutely true. And I wanted no part of it. So.
So you got out in '88, and this is where Avondale Gulfport Marine, 1988 to
right.
89.
Right.
Where you're a test pilot.
Right. That's down in the Gulf, Biloxi, Gulfport, Mississippi area. I was hired as a test pilot because they are the naval contractor that builds the hovercraft. Okay. For the Navy. So they build them, they put them through their own trials, and then Navy personnel come over and they put them through their trials. Mm-hmm. But since I've had, 1,300 hours flying these things, I was and qualified. I was hired as a hovercraft pilot.
But you don't do that very long, and then you get into Naval Criminal Investigative Service. Right,
and the reason for that is because I had the qualification and acceptance for NCIS is a very long process. It takes sometimes a year or two. So I didn't want to be sitting around at my parents' house, 28, 27, I forget how old I was at that point, but I didn't want to be sitting around at my parents' house twiddling my thumbs, eating their groceries. So I wanted to stick with my plan of doing interesting things, and so I back when I was still in the Navy, I believe it was in Yokosuka, Japan. I went ashore and talked to the NCIS office there at Yokosuka and interviewed. So I put in an application while I was still in the Navy, telling them I'm thinking about getting out soon. So what happened was while I was waiting for that whole acceptance process, I went, because like I said, I didn't want to be waiting around. I started working with Avondale Gulfport Marine. And so when my letter came that, hey, we're ready to accept, you've been accepted for training, I quit Avondale Gulfport Marine and then moved back to, actually that training takes place down in the very, very, it was called, the acronym was FLETC, Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, way down on the very southeastern tip of Georgia, near the submarine. It's near the submarine base there, but it's on a federal law enforcement. Secret Service trains there, Customs trains there, some other federal agencies. So I went through training there, got accepted. Got qualified, graduated, and then started going to work for what was then called NIS. Was since been modified to NCIS, but it's the same organization. I worked for them for 5 years at various locations. I started in San Diego, and then got transferred to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, and after that, well, actually, during that period of time, I was notified that my dad had a stroke, and I started administrative efforts to get transferred down to Georgia, and they only have a very, very small office at Dobbins Air Force Base. It's an Air Force base, but they still have a little NCIS office there. And I was told, no, we'd have to create space for you. We're fully manned right now. It's a very small office, so I kept getting declined, and I said, I can't. My dad is in very, very bad shape, and very, very severe stroke, and I just felt like family superseded my own personal interests, and I quit NCIS reluctantly because I could have stayed there for a long time. I enjoyed that work. It was basically like you're like an FBI agent, doing everything they do, as far as crime scene investigations and witness and you do surveillances and virtually everything an FBI agent does, but you're on a military installation or the environs of the military installation.
So that really brings us back to the house then.
Right.
You were telling earlier about the house became available, and you'd already told them to keep you in mind. And what did they do? They call you up and say, "We're going to sell the house.
Right.
We want to put in an offer."
Are you still interested? Is what? Yeah. And I said, "You bet." Of course, that had to be a joint enterprise. My parents, I couldn't have done it by myself, and they couldn't have done it alone. So we pooled our resources, because back then that was, 30 years ago, and the price they were asking for the house probably was fair, but still a lot of money, and my dad had to liquidate stocks and all this other stuff. We had to, get the money, and it was challenging at times. We finally came up with it, and that's, we purchased the house, and then that's where it's like a new phase of my life started then, because I was living back in Georgia now. I was out of the military, and I started work as a private investigator. I got qualified and certified as a PI. So
still doing something similar.
because it was just like a sidestep into something very similar. I didn't have to, I knew how to do surveillance. I knew how to do witness interviews. I knew how to do a crime scene, how to, what to look for. The biggest part, that could be a whole interview in itself. That I'm telling you, the hardest thing in the world is to follow somebody without them knowing it, especially in a rural environment. If you're in a city, you can follow people all over the place. They never know you're there. But there's traffic lights and there's traffic and there's intervening. There's people cutting in front of you, and suddenly you're caught at a red light and they're gone, right? But in the country, you don't have that. But you can't be within sight in this guy's rearview mirror for very long. He starts getting suspicious. Yeah. So you got to hang way back. And when you hang way back, they go over a hill, and then there's a four-way turn with woods everywhere. You can't tell, did the guy turn? Did he left, right? So it's very, very, very interesting and challenging.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I think, it must have been in your genes to have this kind of a background, I think, if you go back to some of the experiences, Civil War experiences of your ancestors.
I've thought about that from time to time. I don't know if that's true or not. It could be, but because the brother that my great-great-grandfather was Captain James Lyle Lemon. In fact, as far as I know, I could be corrected, but last time I checked, he's the only Confederate soldier, officer or enlisted, from Georgia to have received the Confederate Medal of Honor. That happened in 1995, so that would have been after my first interview with you, I believe. But he received from the Sons of Confederate Veterans National Organization. They have the same stipulations and requirements that the Congressional Medal of Honor is. Very, 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 very hard to get approved. It's got to, everything has to be documented with several different sources, and so he was awarded the Confederate Medal of Honor for his efforts at Fort Sanders in Tennessee during Longstreet's detached service to try to
Knoxville.
right right there in Knoxville, yeah. And it's really, really fascinating story. He found himself in a ditch. It was the Yankees had poured water over the glacis of the fort, and so it made it basically a sheet of ice. The Confederates had to climb up, and he found himself. They went through the wire entanglements, which were first in warfare history, as far as anybody knows. They had these wire entanglements out front. They made it through that. Made it through the abattis, which is the trees that were cut down with the branches facing the attacking force. They had to get through that. Then they went down into a ditch right outside the fort, and they were slipping and sliding. They couldn't get up the outside of the fort. So, and there were individual acts of heroism all along that place. But what my ancestor did was take his sword out and plunge it into the embankment. Above his head, and use it to pull himself up. And then he would get a foothold and do the same thing, and he would reach down and pull one or two guys up beneath him. So he had about 10 soldiers with him just below the top of the fort, the rim, and they made a rush over the top and were met with a wall of musketry, and he got shot right through the neck, below his jaw, and came out below his jaw on the left side, and came out in front of his ear on the right side with a I'd say at least .58 caliber mini ball.
He's lucky to survive.
And it must have missed something critical by less than an inch.
Sure.
But he was half blind, couldn't speak, obviously, near death. He was captured when the attack failed. He was put into a federal field hospital, and it took him many months to recover. they actually even took a ramrod and must have dipped it. I don't know what they put on it, but the family story is that they took a ramrod or something long, rigid, thin metal with a silk handkerchief on it, and I guess to clean out the wound, and just pushed it all the way through his neck. And he said he just about came off of that table. But it was he went on to survive and to endure an incredible experience as a prisoner of war. He was sent to Fort Delaware, which is in a little island fortress prison in the middle of the Delaware River. And then near I forget what year it was, must have been 1964, he was sent with 600 other Confederate officer prisoners as an attempt in retribution for what the Northern forces claimed was Confederates allowing Northern prisoners to be under artillery fire in Charleston. That turned out not to be true, really, but they took 600 Confederate prisoners and put them under fire, under direct artillery fire, off of Fort Sumter, between Fort Wagner and Fort Sumter. The artillery duel going back and forth. They built a big pine log stockade out in front of Fort Wagner, so that any Confederate shells falling short would fall in and kill their own men. So that falls under the category of a war crime. But back then, nobody, North didn't care, and still don't acknowledge it. But he went through that and made. It's just an incredible ordeal. I can't go into every part of it, but it's just really an epic saga. And he describes all of it in his memoirs.
Well, tell me about that. You said you discovered the memoir after you bought the house? Right.
I had started noticing little places, because the house had been painted so many times, you could hardly even see it. But once you get some of that off of the weatherboards outside, you could see where Union forces had carved their initials and their unit designations. 53rd Illinois is what I remember, or 53rd Ohio. I can't remember. There's 2 or 3 different places. And then, of course, the one under the stairs where the Sherman's personal secretary carved his, and I guess he was down there looking for something to steal. And but yeah, it was the documents were written in old cloth-bound ledger books, like that many businesses, just about every business had one. It was to keep their customers' accounts in and show what they purchased, how much, and when the bill was settled, they just paid in full, put a line through it. Well, this was before computers, before any of that stuff, so they kept it all on paper. And there were a lot of these books in boxes in the upstairs back corner room that they were going to throw out, but I asked, please don't do that. And then when it took me a while. It wasn't like until another couple of years that I was able to go through all that stuff. But when I did, I discovered that there was 2 handwritten journals in ledger books that were written by him. It's just astonishing. They were written, I think, in the 1880s, early 1880s, which is real interesting because you see, this is just an aside, but it's so common that you see war veterans of any war, really. It's true for Revolutionary War, Civil War, Spanish-American War, World War I, II, Korea. When a guy gets home from a war, they don't feel like writing about war. They want to meet their girlfriend, their wife. They want to start a family. They want to get a job.
Forget about it.
They just put off. But what happens is when they get to reach like middle age, they sort of get that tipping point where it's closer to the end than the beginning, and they've had a full career, they've raised their family, they start thinking, I ought to write this stuff down. So it's sort of a nostalgia plus a feeling of responsibility towards the generations of your family to come.
Sure. Is there a date on it?
Yeah, I think it's 1886. It could be two. I'm not sure, but it's written in early to mid 1880s, which fits 20 years later. Fits it perfectly. By the way, you also see the same thing happening with the statues, Confederate statues, happening right near the late 1800s. I even recently came across a monument company from Marietta that put an ad in the paper that says why they're making the monuments, and it has nothing to do with subjugating people or anything else. It's all about our family members, our war veterans are getting older. What better way to commemorate their service and show that we care about them than making them? So that's what it's about. But anyway, so that finding that journal was just it opened a new door of stuff. It confirmed a lot of stuff that I'd heard about, and added tons of stuff I'd never even imagined.
Let me just add for the record that we have an interview with you in our collection at Kennesaw State University in the archives that was done by Catherine A. Kelly, on November 13th, 1993. It was with you and your mother, Martha. And your father was there, but was not part of the interview because of the stroke.
Right.
But you said at that time that James Lyle Lemon, the one that you're talking about with the Civil War experience, was born in DeKalb County in 1835. And his father, James Lemon, was a pretty important figure in DeKalb County politics. But they moved to Acworth in the 1840s.
1845, I believe.
Yeah, 1845. And then the house is, I believe, 1856. The house that you live in now.
Right.
That James Lyle Lemon built in 1856. He was very young at the time, had recently married Eliza Jane Davenport. And I'm pulling all this out of that interview in 93.
That's right.
But that's basically, your family has been in Acworth, actually moved to Marietta in 43, I guess, and then up to Acworth in 45.
Right.
And has been in Acworth since the 1840s, which is probably about as long as anybody's been here.
Yeah.
Why don't you talk about the house a little bit that they built? It sounds like it's got a basement, from what you were saying, where the secretary to Sherman.
Yeah.
Well, why don't you just describe the house?
Okay. Without getting into dry architectural terminology, which I'm sure nobody's interested in, but it's a two-story wood frame house. It started off though back in the property where it sits was part of the 1838 Cherokee land lottery, and that plot of land, which I believe back then was 160 acres, was drawn by a man named Yearly Martin. He kept it for a few years. I don't really know exactly how many years. It wasn't much, but he probably kept it long enough to build a single pen structure there. So there was a structure on the site. Of course, when James moved in there, bought the property from him, moved his family in there. I don't know I don't know exactly when they started expanding on that single pen structure. Whether it was when Captain Lemon's father, James, moved there in 1845, or whether when James the Younger got married in 1856 and started expanding it. It was somewhere in that period, but they started coming out on all sides of that single pin structure. The original core of that house is the dining room. And I know this from looking at some of the previous owners' photographs, actually going under the house and looking at the beams it's built on. You can tell this was different than the whole rest of the house.
So there's really a house before 56.
Right.
That's still part of the house
Right.
today.
Yeah, which is not uncommon. Now, the basement part of it, that didn't come along until probably the 20th century. The basement, back in the Civil War days, antebellum days, and then the war, was sitting on brick piers. It was just sitting on 2 to 2.5 foot brick piers, and you could look all the way underneath the house onto the other side.
So it's a crawl space?
It was houses were not built like flat on the ground back then. They had to be built off the ground, or the moisture would just rot the floors. So they were built, and in the summer, air flowing underneath would help cool the house. Dogs would run under there, chickens would run. It was just a place for. But what happened was Hilton Nichols, who was the owner back in the early 20th century, he
married into the Lemon family.
He married Maria Lemon, who was one of Captain James's daughters. Well, he started making improvements on that. Wait a minute. John Nichols married Maria, and that's one of their sons was Hilton. So I missed a generation. But he got the idea that he wanted to build a basement, and I don't.
Hilton built a basement.
Hilton, right? I think he died in early 1960s or 68 or something like that. But he was married to Grace Nichols, whose daughter Grace and Sarah died in the fire in the 1970s. That was big news around here. He had already passed away. So his widow Grace and his daughter Sarah were there at the house when the fire started. But his nickname was Jit. They called him Jit Nichols. But Grace's husband was a man who, how he did this, I don't know, because I'm trying to envision how he did this. He had to have crawled under the house, and you don't have but about that much space. So how he started digging, and I guess he had helpers carting this stuff out by the bucket, and just digging down until he had enough space to stand up or move around in, and it just kept. So the front part of the house, the big block part of the house, not the wing that goes back, but the front square part of that house has got a basement underneath it.
Wow.
And it was done by hand by him. And today they still have the old giant drum. It's big tank. It's a heating oil tank that's still underneath there. That probably needs to be gotten out, but I haven't figured out how to get it out. There's nowhere.
So the front part now has a basement, and the back part still
It's crawl space.
Crawl space.
Yeah, it's kind of like you can scrunch your body up and kind of walk through it like that in some places, but mostly it's.
No, I understand. We've got a house just like that. It's a 1930s house, but it has crawl space in the front and then big enough to stand up in the back.
Yeah, so that's the house has had that has been a major endeavor of mine over the last 30 years, is having to do the detective work on the evolution of that house, because it's not what it used to be. Today has a certain appearance, and back in 1856 it looks similar, but it's just
a Greek revival, or
it's what I call a Carolina style Greek revival, and I just pull this name out of my own head, because I did a lot of traveling in the Carolinas, especially South Carolina and Western North Carolina and Eastern North Carolina, and there are a lot of antebellum homes in the Carolinas that don't have gable end chimneys. You know, where you can look at the side of a house and there's a whole chimney going up the side.
Right.
They're central mounted. They're interior mounted chimneys, so that the chimney can have a firebox in this room and a firebox in that room,
Yeah.
and you can one chimney can heat 4 rooms if it's a 2-story house. So that's how this house is built, with interior centrally mounted chimneys. So and I only saw that. You don't see that in Georgia very much at all. I only saw it in the Carolinas, which they came from. The family came from
South Carolina.
Charleston to Fishing Creek to Chester area to Anderson, which is near the Georgia line. So they just kept moving closer and closer to Georgia, and then they moved on into Decatur. But they kind of took that style with them, apparently, because I haven't seen any other house that has the same kind of chimneys.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. It's just, it's what we call informed speculation.
Yeah. Okay, so when that officer or the secretary for Sherman, he's going down into a crawl space where he carved his name?
Now, what that was during the war was, that's a good question, because it begs the question, what was the guy doing if there's no basement? See, but he's still on the ground floor. The stairs are going up like this. Well, here's the floor. Well, there's a little wall here there's a little door that allows you to go in that door, and it was like a little pantry. And so that's where it was carved. He was in that pantry. He wasn't down in the basement.
Okay.
There was no basement then. He was still standing on the ground floor, but hunched over in that pantry, probably looking for stuff, and just thought, I'll just carve my name. There's who knows why, but because
you were saying before the interview started that there's also proof in a document, I guess, of the official records,
right,
that Sherman was in the Lemon house.
Oh, there's no doubt. I have it printed out. It's a dispatch. I believe it was dated June 8th, 1864. Dictated to his aide or his secretary, just talking about Army movements and Army dispositions and whatnot. And it's the heading is Lemon House, Acworth, Georgia. But I mean, before I even found that, or before it was provided to me, it was family lore. We just knew, because I mean the whole story. Oh, and that brings up something I wanted to mention before I have to quit, is June 6th, 1864. Most of Acworth had refugees south. A lot of them went to Cuthbert, other towns, but they got the hell out of town because they knew the Yankee Army was coming. And the town was not completely, but it was pretty much vacated. And Eliza, who was the mistress of the house, Captain Lemon's wife, refused to leave the house. She was 7 months pregnant and said, "I'm not going anywhere."
Right.
And I always admire her for this, that she stayed when younger, stronger people left.
So she was like living upstairs while the...
Oh no. There's even a drawing. I don't know if you've seen this drawing by Theodore Davis. It was the special artist for Harper's Weekly, which is like the newspaper back then, periodical. And each publication had like a special artist that would be traveling with the Army, and he would do sketches. And the process was he'd do a sketch, he'd get it on a dispatch, whether it's by writer or by train or somehow, back to the main office, and usually in New York, where the staff engravers, or it would go through an editor first. The editor would go and say, that's not important enough. Yeah, that's something we're going to print. and he would give these important drawings, hand-drawn drawings, to a man who does metal or wood engraving, usually metal at this point. It was steel engraving. So that guy would sit there with a drawing and copy that drawing onto a steel plate with an inscribing pen. Would and that would then be put on a roller and it would print, because they couldn't print photographs back then. Well, yeah, there is a drawing that was apparently never used, but it's hand signed by Theodore Davis, and it's incredible. It shows the house, and it shows the army. You can see troops filing around the eastern side of the house, and you can see officers on horseback closer to the artist in front of the house, and they're pointing, and one of them is Sherman, and he's got his staff officers seated. Well, in the middle background, this is the part I love of this drawing. You can see what look like civilians standing out in front of the house in the walk, and one of them is a woman. And you can see just by her dress and everything. She's pointing, or she's gesturing at the officer that's coming towards her, and behind her are I think they're blacks, civilians, and one of them is a woman, black woman, holding a little girl's hand, and that's Mariah, because she was 2 to 3 years old then, just a little thing, and so what they did was they told her, lady, she said, I'm not leaving, and they said, you want to stay here, but we're taking this house over. And they forced her, and I need to mention this, by the way. In 1856, James, who later went on into the war, who was not present then, James had freed the 7 slaves that he had inherited from his father. When he got married in 1856, the house was finished in 1856, and he freed his slaves in 1856. 5 full years before the war started. It was highly unusual. It happened, but it was not a normal thing. But they were all free, and they all continued to live on the property and work for a wage. They were paid employees. So they were former slaves, but they were free. And
Wow.
yeah, so
I thought it wasn't easy to free a slave at that time in Georgia.
I don't know. He managed to do it, because this is.
Do you know their names, any of them?
I do. I only remember one, and that was a boy who grew up the same time that James did. His name was Bap, B-A-P, and he later went out, begged his former master to go accompany him to the front, and he let him go to the front. Got as far as Goldsboro, North Carolina, when there was an incident that happened where the local sheriff and his deputy, while James went in, the train they were on stopped in Goldsboro for lunch, just for whatever, take on water or whatever, and the passengers disembarked to have lunch. Well, Bap, who was the free black accompanying Captain Lemon, was not allowed in the hotel. They were eating in a hotel restaurant. So he had to wait outside. Well, by the time James came out, he said he brought him some corn pone and some ham or something. By the time he came out, Bap was gone. He couldn't find him. So he asked the guy sitting out front, he said, have you seen anybody out here? And he said, well, yeah, the patrollers got him, and they got him down the alley. And he went around the alley and saw the sheriff and his deputy pinning this guy up against the wall, and he had a walking stick kind of like up under his neck, and his deputy had a double-barrel shotgun pointed at him, and they were like trying to get this guy's, they were basically taking him in and going to take him in and conscript him as a laborer for the army. And James came down the alley and said, no, wait, this man's with me. He's a free Negro. and the guy answered back something kind of off color about what he's seen of so-called free Negroes, and James pulled out. He had a Lamat pistol. I don't know if you've ever seen a Lamat pistol, but it's an over-under. I think it's a 9mm over a shotgun. It has a shotgun barrel and a pistol barrel together.
So James pulls that out?
He pulls it out and points it at the sheriff and says, you let this man go or I'm going to take your head off at the neck. And, there was an encounter there. He finally got the guy to drop his cane, drop his gun, and they made their way back up the. By this time, a crowd had gathered, and kind of a hostile crowd, I believe, and they had to force their way through this crowd. And he put back on the train and told them, next stop, you're heading back home. He just made him go back home, and he went back home, and that he was there present when Sherman and his staff moved into the house, took it over, but the incident is just incredible that happened. They told her she could stay in the house, but she'd have to live in the kitchen with the former black cook. They just slept on the pallet on the floor in the kitchen. They had to have a fire going all the time. They had to have hot water for the general because he liked his coffee. And the general, Sherman, didn't. His staff stayed in the house, but he stayed in the house just to the west. It's still there. It's a smaller house, and that was owned by our family, but it was a tenant resident. It was a rental property. So Sherman
stayed in the tenant residence
for privacy, and and every morning he would take the short walk. Well, it's like 40 yards or less from that house over to and meet his staff in the dining room, and it was at one of these breakfasts. I'm not sure whether it was a breakfast or dinner, but one of these meals where Sherman was holding court with his officers sitting around the dining room table, and that Eliza came in. She was forced to serve them coffee. So she had a coffee pot and was pouring coffee for these Yankee officers who were on Sherman's staff. One of them was the Dayton, who was his staff officer. And if I could quickly read this.
Yes, I wanted to remind you of
Yeah, because it's this is good. This is priceless. This is my favorite part of the whole. And now this is a document written by James, my great-great-grandfather, whose wife was Eliza, who this happened to, and he wrote this by talking to witnesses. He wrote it after getting home after the war, talking to his wife, talking to Bap, who was there. So, two witnesses described this event to him. Now, he wrote this though when he was a POW. I mean, what I'm trying to say is he wrote it from the aspect of when I was a prisoner, I was notified in a letter by my wife that this happened. The most infuriating outrage, however, which was visited upon my family, was the barbaric practice the idle Yankees camped about our place employed of randomly shooting through the walls of our kitchen, in which Eliza and little Mariah and our servants were compelled to live and serve the Yankees. It surely was only by the hand of Providence that no ball found its mark. She also reported the most astounding news, and that was that Sherman himself occupied our house, using our small tenant house, which I already mentioned, as his sleeping quarters. General Sherman would visit our house and see and hold counsel with his officers several times a day. And each time he came, his officers would scurry about, seeing to his whims. Eliza was ordered by an officer named Dayton to always have a pot of hot coffee ready for him at all times. As for the general himself, I like this part, Eliza described him as the most rude and officious scoundrel she ever met, and devoid of any humane or gentlemanly quality whatsoever. An amusing anecdote, which was told to me by Bap after the war and confirmed by Eliza, that may illustrate the character of the man. On one such occasion, when Sherman was holding court at our dining table, Eliza was brought in to serve coffee to the assembled officers, perhaps intending to amuse or impress his officers. Sherman began a conversation with her, V-I-Z, which I think means in this manner.
Yeah.
Archaic term, I guess. Sherman, I am told, madam, that your husband is a rebel officer. Eliza said, he's an officer in the Confederate Army, if that is your meaning. Sherman, so it is. Where is he now? Eliza, in one of your Yankee prisons. Sherman, I see. Well, never mind. He is in his proper place. Eliza, what is your meaning, sir? Sherman, I mean, madam, that prison is just the place for anyone who takes up arms in rebellion against his government. Upon hearing this remark, his assembled officers were heard to chuckle most arrogantly. Eliza was as good as this remark, and did him one better, answering, I'll wager, sir, that if there is ever to be a prison for Yankee generals who pillage and plunder and burn out innocent persons from their homes or shoot helpless invalids like poor old Mr. Mitchell lying sick in his bed, that you would rank highly among its inhabitants. Sherman replied in a grave tone that with but a word from him she would in a twinkling be arrested and in irons. Eliza quite recklessly but gravely answered, Arrest me, yes, that is all you know, you brute, arresting women and mothers of infants. You make war upon helpless citizens, old men and women and children, burn their homes and shoot and steal our property and livestock without apology or payment, and now you come uninvited into my house and eat my food without obviously feeling obliged to act like a gentleman. But by God, sir, I will not permit you to add to your effrontery by sitting yourself down in this house and insulting the good man who built it. Sherman, clearly seeing his predicament, ordered her to be removed from his presence, but did not arrest her, perhaps respecting her grit, but most likely understanding that he had been successfully outmaneuvered, and that he did not dare have her arrested lest he lend truth to her charges. He did, however, ensure that whenever he entered the house, Eliza was kept in the kitchen and out of his sight.
So no more serving coffee.
Yeah. So, I mean, I read that, and I just want to hug that lady, because that's the spirit of the South.
And did Bap take the Lemon surname, or did he have a surname?
That's the sad part of that story. I don't know anything about what happened to any of them, because I haven't been able to find. I know that the family story is that they stayed there until after the war, but and James, the returning veteran, provided money for them actually in his will, he provided money for poor white families. It's interesting because it's the way the times was. But it was designated in his will that he would provide a certain amount of money for the poor white families of Acworth, and the same amount of money for the poor black families of Acworth. So, which kind of remarkable at the time, I think. But no, unfortunately we don't know what happened to them.
It's too bad.
Yeah.
Just wondered if
I would
descendants.
I would love to find that out.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a lot more that we could talk about. I just refer people to the 1993 interview where you talked about Smith Lemon, who would be brother to, I guess, older brother of James Lyle,
Right.
and a banker. They were both bankers, I guess.
That spurs my memory of what you were saying earlier. As to, are you getting some of this from your ancestors? I think the two brothers were a study in contrast. Smith was frail, not very healthy, and very, very cerebral, very, very smart businessman. His brother, James, which is my direct ancestor, was more robust, more active, more. He was a great combat officer, and a very dynamic individual. But he was a good businessman as well. So he was able to cover all the bases. If I take anything from him, it's certainly not the business acumen, but it's more of the, interesting life experiences kind of thing.